There are wolves who announce their power with fanfare and fury, marking their territory with displays of dominance that echo through stone halls and leave lesser creatures trembling in their wake. Then there are those who carry death so quietly that it whispers rather than roars. Predators who have learned that true strength needs no audience, no applause, no acknowledgement beyond the simple fact of its existence. Isla belonged to the latter, though few would have recognized the distinction by looking at her bent shoulders and downcast eyes as she navigated the smoke-filled chaos of the Silver Fang Tavern. To the Lycan patrons who filled the establishment night after night, she was nothing more than another human servant, disposable, forgettable, existing only to carry ale and absorb insults with the practiced invisibility that kept her kind breathing. She had perfected this performance over 3 years of careful survival, learning to move through crowds of drunken warriors like mist through morning air, never quite present enough to invite attention, never quite absent enough to be accused of laziness. Her sleeves stayed long to hide the map of scars that told stories she could never speak aloud. Her voice stayed soft to avoid triggering the volatile tempers that turned tavern brawls into bloodbaths. And her eyes stayed lowered to prevent anyone from seeing the depths they contained. For in those depths lived memories of another life, one where she had been called by a different name, where her hands had held weapons instead of serving trays, where her silence had been tactical choice rather than survival necessity. The woman who could disable 3 armed men before they could draw breath to scream still existed beneath the servant's carefully constructed facade. But she had learned to bury that part of herself so deeply that sometimes even she forgot it was there. Until the night when Prince Adrian Stoneheart decided that humiliating a human waitress would provide amusing entertainment for his sycophantic companions. And Isla's carefully maintained mask cracked just enough to let something far more dangerous slip through. The Silver Fang Tavern reeked of sweat, ale, and the particular mixture of leather and steel that clung to Lycan warriors like a second skin. Smoke from countless pipes and the great hearth created a perpetual haze that softened edges and muffled sounds, turning the cavernous space into something between den and battlefield. Tonight, like most nights, it was packed to capacity with off-duty soldiers, minor nobles, and the sort of wolves who measured their worth in scars and territory conquered. Isla moved through the chaos like a ghost given temporary form, her wooden tray balanced with unconscious grace of someone who had learned to navigate hostile territory without drawing predatory attention. 3 tankards of ale, 2 meat pies still steaming from the kitchen, and a bowl of thick stew that passed for sustenance in establishments where humans were considered fortunate to receive scraps. "Table 7, she murmured to herself, a habit developed during her first terrifying weeks when the names and faces of violent customers blurred together into an endless parade of potential threats. Lord Marcus and his hunting party. The one who grabbed Sarah last month. She had learned to catalog the dangerous ones, not just their faces, but their patterns, their triggers, their particular brands of cruelty. Lord Marcus favored humiliation over violence, preferring to make servants squirm with verbal torment rather than physical abuse. "Your orders, my lords," Isla said quietly, placing each item with practiced precision while keeping her eyes fixed on the scarred wooden table. "About time," Lord Marcus growled, though his tone held more ritual complaint than genuine anger. "Thought you'd gotten lost on the way from the kitchen, girl." "My apologies for the delay, my lord. The kitchen was— Did I ask for explanations?" Marcus's voice sharpened with the quick temper that made him dangerous, despite his preference for psychological torture. "Servants speak when spoken to, not to make excuses for their incompetence." "Yes, my lord." Isla stepped back, the precisely measured distance that indicated respectful availability without presumptuous hovering. "Will there be anything else?" One of Marcus's companions, a younger Lycan with soft features that spoke of a life unacquainted with real hardship, leaned forward with predatory interest. "You know, Marcus, I've always wondered, do human servants actually feel shame? Or do they simply mimic the emotion because they know it's expected?" The question was clearly meant to provoke some form of reaction that could then be used as justification for further torment. "An interesting philosophical question, Lord Garrett," Marcus replied with false thoughtfulness. "Perhaps we should conduct an experiment." Isla's muscles tensed imperceptibly as she recognized the shift in tone that preceded deliberate humiliation. "Drop the tray," Marcus commanded suddenly. Isla blinked, certain she had misheard. "My lord?" "The tray. Drop it. Let's see how human shame manifests when their incompetence is on display." The order made no sense beyond its function as arbitrary cruelty designed to create a mess that would then become grounds for further punishment. I don't understand, my lord." "It's a simple command, girl. Release your grip and let the tray fall. Unless you're suggesting that a human servant knows better than Lycan nobility what should be done." The challenge was carefully constructed to leave no acceptable response. Comply, and she would be punished for the mess and waste. Refuse, and she would be punished for disobedience. Isla was preparing to drop the tray and accept whatever consequences followed, when a new voice cut through the tavern's ambient noise like a blade through silk. "Well, well, what have we here?" Every conversation at nearby tables immediately stopped. Isla felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the voice that belonged to Prince Adrian Stoneheart, heir to the Lycan throne, and the most dangerous predator in a kingdom built on predation. Adrian approached their table with loose-limbed confidence of someone who had never faced a threat he couldn't either buy, intimidate, or kill. At 27, he possessed all the physical advantages of royal Lycan bloodline: height, strength, speed, and healing that made ordinary weapons little more than temporary inconveniences. But it was his complete lack of restraint that made him truly terrifying. "Prince Adrian!" Lord Marcus rose quickly, his earlier arrogance immediately replaced by careful deference. "An unexpected pleasure, Your Highness?" "Sit, Marcus. I'm not here for formal courtesies." Adrian's amber eyes fixed on Isla with focused intensity of a predator that had found something interesting to pursue. "I'm here because I heard something amusing about conducting experiments on human servants." "Your Highness," Marcus said carefully, "we were merely discussing philosophical questions about human nature." "Philosophical questions?" Adrian laughed, the sound carrying no warmth whatsoever. "How wonderfully academic. Tell me, Marcus, what conclusions have you reached?" "Well, Your Highness, we were observing that humans seem to mimic emotional responses rather than experiencing genuine—" "Boring," Adrian waved dismissively. "Too much talking, not enough practical demonstration. If you want to understand human nature, you need to observe it under pressure." He turned his full attention to Isla, his amber eyes taking in every detail with thoroughness of someone evaluating a potential purchase. "You, servant. What's your name?" "Isla, Your Highness," she replied quietly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her system. "Isla." Adrian repeated her name as if testing its sound. "Tell me, Isla, do you consider yourself fortunate to serve in an establishment frequented by Lycan nobility?" The question was a trap. Every possible answer carrying potential for punishment. "I am grateful for the opportunity to serve, Your Highness," Isla said finally, choosing the response most likely to be considered appropriately humble. "Grateful," Adrian mused. "How wonderfully conventional. But gratitude is such an abstract concept, don't you think? Perhaps we should test the depth of your appreciation through more concrete demonstration." Without warning, Adrian's boot connected with Isla's shin, not hard enough to break bone, but with sufficient force to send her stumbling backward into the stone pillar behind their table. The tray flew from her hands as she fought to maintain her balance, sending tankards and food scattering across the floor in a symphony of breaking pottery and spilled ale. Laughter erupted from Adrian's companions as Isla slumped against the pillar, her leg throbbing from the impact. "There we are," Adrian announced with satisfaction. "Much more educational than philosophical discussion. Observe how quickly human gratitude transforms into something more honest when they're reminded of their proper place." But as Isla pushed herself away from the pillar and straightened to face her tormentor, something had changed in her posture, that made the laughter die in several throats. Her head was no longer bowed in submission, her shoulders no longer curved in defensive hunching. When she looked directly at Prince Adrian for the first time, her storm-gray eyes held depths that made even drunk Lycans suddenly sober. "Your Highness," Isla said quietly, her voice carrying a quality that none of them had heard before. Not servility or fear, but controlled calm of someone who had made a decision that could not be unmade. Was that supposed to hurt? The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in a throne room. Adrian's expression shifted from amused superiority to something far more dangerous. "Excuse me," he said slowly, his voice dropping to the register that usually preceded violence. Isla smiled then. Not the forced expression of a servant trying to placate an angry master, but something altogether more predatory. "I asked if that was supposed to hurt, Your Highness, because if it was, I think we need to have a conversation about expectations versus reality." The tavern's main floor had gone completely quiet now. "I think," Adrian said finally, his voice carrying the particular calm that preceded extreme violence, "that you've forgotten your place, servant. Perhaps another reminder is in order." This time, his kick was aimed higher and delivered with full strength that royal Lycan blood provided. It should have doubled Isla over, should have sent her crashing into the wall with potentially serious injuries. Instead, she moved. The movement was so fast, so precise, that most of the watching crowd missed the actual mechanics of what happened. One moment, Prince Adrian was launching a kick that could have shattered ribs. The next, he was face down on the tavern floor with his arm twisted behind his back, at an angle that suggested dislocated joints, and Isla was kneeling beside him with one hand positioned at the base of his skull. "Here's the thing about expectations," Isla said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather rather than restraining the heir to the Lycan throne. "I spent 3 years learning yours. You expect humans to cower and apologize and beg for mercy when you decide to use us for entertainment. You expect us to be helpless, harmless, forgettable." She applied slightly more pressure, and Adrian's struggles immediately ceased as pain flooded through his nervous system. "But sometimes, Your Highness, expectations can be dangerous things. Because when you expect helplessness, you don't prepare for competence. When you expect cowering, you don't guard against someone who was trained to kill." Before she learned to walk. The silence in the tavern was absolute now. A human servant had not only defied royal authority, but had disabled a Lycan prince with effortless precision. "Now," Isla continued, her voice maintaining that same conversational tone despite the explosive tension radiating from every direction, "we can handle this situation in several ways. I can release you, you can return to your table, and we can pretend this was all a misunderstanding caused by too much ale and poor judgment." Or she let the alternative hang unspoken, but the implications were clear to everyone watching. From the tavern's upper gallery, where private booths provided vantage points for wealthy patrons to observe without being observed, Lycan King Thorn Stoneheart watched his son's casual cruelty transform into a masterclass in combat efficiency. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, everything he thought he knew about the harmless human girl serving drinks in his kingdom's most notorious tavern crumbled into ash. Thorn had come to the Silver Fang Tavern tonight to conduct unofficial business with merchants who preferred to avoid palace scrutiny, not to witness his heir being systematically humiliated by a human waitress. But as he watched Isla's precise movements, noted the professional economy of her restraint technique, and recognized the particular way she held herself that spoke of military training, puzzle pieces clicked into place that created a picture he had never expected to see. The scars she hid beneath long sleeves, the way she moved through crowds without quite touching anyone, the unconscious habits of someone accustomed to assessing threats and escape routes. And now the combat skills that should not have existed in a human servant working in a Lycan tavern. Isla was not what she appeared to be. The question was whether her true identity made her an asset to be acquired or a threat to be eliminated. As if sensing the weight of royal attention, Isla looked up toward the gallery where shadows concealed the king's presence. For just a moment her eyes met his across the distance, and Thorn saw recognition there, not of his face, which she had never seen, but of the authority he represented. She knew she had been seen. She knew that her carefully maintained invisibility had been shattered beyond repair. But instead of fear or panic, what Thorn saw in those storm-gray eyes was calculation. The cold assessment of a professional evaluating new parameters and adjusting strategy accordingly. The quiet servant was gone, and in her place sat something far more dangerous. "Let him go." The voice cut through the silence like steel scraping stone. Lord Commander Garrett Ironwood approached with measured steps, his hand resting on the pommel of a sword that had seen action in 3 separate territorial wars. Behind him came 4 of his elite guards, their positions carefully coordinated to surround the disturbance without, appearing overtly threatening. Isla's eyes tracked their movements with professional interest, noting approach angles, weapon positions, and the particular way trained soldiers moved when they were preparing for violence, but hoping to avoid it. "Lord Commander," she said politely, as if they were discussing the evening's menu rather than the potential execution of the royal heir. "How can I be of service?" Ironwood stopped just outside what he estimated to be her striking range, though Isla could see from his positioning that he had miscalculated significantly. "You can start by releasing His Highness and assuming a position of submission," Ironwood said carefully. "Whatever grievance you believe you have can be addressed through proper channels, but assaulting royal blood carries consequences that extend far beyond your own life." "Assault?" Isla's voice carried a note of genuine surprise. "Lord Commander, I'm confused about the sequence of events you witnessed. His Highness kicked me twice while I was attempting to perform my duties as a servant in this establishment. I defended myself using minimal force necessary to prevent further attacks. If anything, I've shown remarkable restraint in not responding with the level of violence that such unprovoked aggression would normally warrant." The reframing was masterful, transforming her from aggressor to victim, while simultaneously demonstrating that she understood both military protocol and legal precedent. Several of the watching Lycans exchanged glances as they realized she was technically correct. "You're saying," Ironwood said slowly, "that you consider this self-defense." "I'm saying that when someone attacks me, regardless of their title or bloodline, I respond appropriately to ensure my continued survival. The alternative, allowing myself to be beaten for entertainment, seems considerably less appealing." Prince Adrian stirred beneath her restraint, attempting to speak, but Isla's grip tightened slightly, and his words dissolved into a pained grunt. "Here's the thing," Isla continued conversationally. "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what's happening here. His Highness seems to believe that humans exist primarily for his amusement, available to be kicked and humiliated whenever he desires entertainment. I, on the other hand, maintain that being human doesn't automatically make someone a victim." She looked directly at Lord Commander Ironwood. "The question before us now is whether the Crown believes that royal blood grants immunity from consequences when those consequences are delivered by someone you've underestimated." From his concealed position in the upper gallery, King Thorn watched the exchange with growing fascination. The woman restraining his son was conducting what amounted to a legal negotiation, while maintaining physical dominance over a trained Lycan warrior, demonstrating sophistication that suggested education far beyond anything available in human settlements. Thorn rose from his seat and moved to the gallery's edge where his presence would be visible to those below, though the shadows still concealed his identity from most observers. Isla's gaze flickered upward for just a moment, and Thorn saw her posture shift almost imperceptibly, not with fear or submission, but with subtle alertness of a professional who had identified a new variable in the tactical equation. "Lord Commander," she said quietly, "I believe we have attracted attention from parties who might prefer to see this situation resolved with minimal disruption to the evening's other activities." It was a delicate reference to the fact that many of the tavern's upper-level patrons conducted business that wouldn't benefit from close royal scrutiny. "What do you propose?" Ironwood asked. "I release His Highness unharmed. He returns to his companions with an entertaining story about human unpredictability, and everyone continues with their evening as if this were merely an amusing interlude, rather than a formal incident requiring official documentation. Isla's tone remained level, but her meaning was clear. She was offering everyone involved a face-saving exit, and if His Highness chooses to pursue the matter further, then I suppose we discover whether the Crown considers the precedent of royal immunity from consequences to be more important than the principle that actions carry results regardless of who performs them. Isla's smile was pleasant and absolutely terrifying. I'm curious about the answer myself. Release him, Ironwood said finally. Slowly and with your hands visible at all times. Isla nodded and began the careful process of disengaging from her restraint position. She moved with deliberate precision, ensuring that Adrian couldn't suddenly reverse their positions. When Prince Adrian finally rolled away and struggled to his feet, his face was flushed with humiliation and rage. You, he snarled, his voice rough, have made the gravest error of your miserable existence. Isla rose gracefully, brushing tavern debris from her dress with movements that managed to suggest both humility and complete lack of concern. Your Highness, she said respectfully, I hope you weren't seriously injured during your fall. The floors here can be quite treacherous, especially when one has been celebrating with friends. The reframing was masterful, transforming his defeat into an unfortunate accident while making clear she understood exactly what had happened. Fall? Adrian's voice rose dangerously. You think what just happened was a fall? I think what just happened was an unfortunate series of events that began when someone decided to use physical violence against a non-combatant, Isla replied calmly. The specific details of how such situations resolve themselves tend to depend on the participants involved. Adrian took a step toward her, his hands clenching into fists, but before he could close the distance, a new voice cut through the tension with the authority of absolute power. That will be sufficient. Every head in the tavern turned toward the speaker, and a collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd as King Thorn Stoneheart emerged from the shadows of the upper gallery. He descended the stairs with measured steps, his presence immediately transforming the atmosphere from dangerous confrontation to royal audience. Thorn was not as physically imposing as his son, but authority radiated from him in waves that made even drunk Lycans straighten their posture. Father, Adrian began, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and apprehension. This human attacked me without provocation. I saw what happened, Thorn interrupted quietly, his amber eyes moving between Adrian and Isla with calculating precision. I observed the entire encounter from beginning to resolution. The simple statement carried implications that made several people in the crowd suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. Your Majesty, Isla said, dropping into a curtsy that was technically perfect, while somehow managing to suggest that she was choosing to show respect rather than being compelled to do so. I hope the evening's entertainment hasn't been too disruptive to your other activities. Thorn studied her for a long moment, taking in details that his son had missed. Rise, he commanded. State your name and origin. Isla Merrick, Your Majesty. I've served in this establishment for 3 years. Previously worked in various household positions throughout the kingdom. The response was factually accurate while revealing absolutely nothing of substance. Household positions, he repeated thoughtfully. With whom did you serve? Various minor nobles, Your Majesty. Nothing that would be familiar to someone of your position. And where, he asked softly, did you acquire the combat training that enabled you to disable a Lycan prince? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Isla was silent for several heartbeats, her expression cycling through internal debate. When she finally spoke, her voice carried careful selection of words that would be technically truthful, while strategically incomplete. Your Majesty, I spent my childhood in regions where humans required practical skills for survival. The specific details are less important than the general principle that one learns what circumstances require. Which regions specifically? The contested territories along the eastern border, Your Majesty, during the period when territorial control was fluid. A chill settled over the gathered crowd as the implications registered. The eastern border conflicts had been brutal, involving multiple Lycan packs fighting for control over territory. Humans caught in those regions had faced choices between fleeing, dying, or learning to fight. But the eastern conflicts had also been where certain experimental military programs had been conducted, training initiatives that officially didn't exist, designed to test whether humans could be developed into effective special operations assets. If Isla was a product of those programs, then her presence here represented far more than a servant with unexpected skills. The eastern border conflicts ended 7 years ago, Thorne said carefully. All humans in those territories were relocated to approved settlement areas under Crown protection. Yes, Your Majesty, Isla agreed quietly. There are not. The admission carried weight that went far beyond simple geographical facts. Thorne made a decision that would reshape multiple lives before the night was over. Lord Commander Ironwood, he said without taking his eyes off Isla, I want this woman placed in protective custody pending full investigation into her background and potential security implications. Treat her as a person of interest rather than a prisoner, but ensure that she remains available for questioning. Your Majesty, Ironwood replied immediately. Shall I assign standard guard rotation or... Captain Morris and his personal detail, full security protocols, private quarters in the castle, and access restricted to essential personnel only. He turned to address his son. Adrian, you will return to the palace and report to the duty officer for medical evaluation. Any injuries sustained during this evening's entertainment will be properly documented for official records. Father, you can't seriously be considering... I am considering the security implications of discovering that highly trained combat specialists are operating within our territory without proper oversight, Thorne interrupted coldly. Your personal embarrassment, while noted, is secondary to matters of kingdom security. As guards moved to escort both Prince Adrian and Isla from the tavern, Thorne caught her eyes one final time. Miss Merrick, he said quietly. I suspect tomorrow's conversation will prove illuminating for all parties involved. Isla's slight smile suggested that she was looking forward to the discussion as much as he was. Dawn crept through the narrow window of Isla's quarters like a reluctant witness, casting pale light across stone walls that had contained far more dangerous prisoners than a displaced tavern servant. She had spent the night in careful meditation, preparing for conversations that would determine whether she lived to see another sunset. The accommodations told her much about King Thorne's intentions. This was not a cell designed for punishment, but a secure room meant for valuable prisoners whose cooperation might be purchased rather than extracted. Captain Morris arrived precisely at midday. Miss Merrick, Morris said formally, His Majesty requests your presence for discussion of matters pertaining to kingdom security. Will you accompany us voluntarily, or do we need to implement additional precautions? Isla rose, smoothing her dress with movements that emphasized her non-threatening posture. Of course, Captain. I'm curious to hear what His Majesty has discovered during his investigations. The throne room where they brought her was smaller and more intimate than the grand ceremonial hall, designed for private consultations and sensitive discussions. King Thorne sat not on his throne, but in a chair beside a table covered with documents. Lord Commander Ironwood stood nearby, his expression carefully neutral. Miss Merrick, Thorne said as she was escorted to a chair across from him. Thank you for agreeing to this discussion. I hope your accommodations have been adequate. Very comfortable, Your Majesty. Thank you. Yes, about that. Thorne leaned forward slightly. My investigators have conducted thorough inquiries into your background, and they've discovered some interesting discrepancies. He gestured to the documents spread across the table. According to official records, Isla Merrick has indeed worked as a servant in various noble households throughout my kingdom for the past 3 years. References are excellent, work history consistent, no incidents of misconduct. I'm gratified that my employers found my service satisfactory, Your Majesty. Indeed. However, what's fascinating is that prior to 3 years ago, Isla Merrick simply didn't exist. No birth records, no family history, No documentation of any kind until the day you appeared seeking employment. He selected a specific document. More intriguing still, the description of your combat skills matches techniques taught in classified military programs that were officially discontinued 7 years ago. The trap was expertly laid. Isla considered her options carefully. Your Majesty, I think we both understand that sometimes official discontinuation and actual termination are different things. And sometimes people acquire new identities because their old ones became inconvenient. Inconvenient for whom? For anyone who preferred that certain activities remain buried along with the people who participated in them. Thorn nodded slowly. Tell me about the Crimson Dagger program. Isla's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. I'm not familiar with that designation, Your Majesty. No? Interesting, because according to classified files that required significant effort to locate, the Crimson Dagger program was an experimental initiative designed to train human operatives for deep infiltration and assassination missions in Lycan territories. The program supposedly produced 12 successful graduates before being terminated due to political concerns. He leaned back. Those files also indicate that all program participants were declared dead to maintain operational security. Their original identities buried so deeply that no trace would remain if they were captured. That sounds like a very thorough approach to operational security, Your Majesty. It does, doesn't it? Of course, declaring someone dead for security purposes doesn't actually kill them. It simply makes them extremely difficult to trace. Isla remained silent. The thing is, Thorn continued, I've been wondering why a highly trained operative would choose to spend 3 years serving ale to drunk Lycans when her skills could be employed for far more lucrative purposes. Unless, of course, the tavern assignment wasn't employment, but positioning. Positioning for what, Your Majesty? That's what I'm hoping you'll tell me. Because if you've been conducting surveillance on my kingdom for 3 years, then you either represent a threat I need to eliminate or intelligence I need to acquire. And frankly, after watching you handle my son last night, I'm more interested in the latter possibility. The shift in approach was masterfully executed. Your Majesty, may I speak frankly? Please do. The Crimson Dagger program was indeed discontinued 7 years ago, but not because of ethical concerns. It was terminated because certain political factions within your court discovered that trained human operatives posed potential threats to established power structures. She paused. The official story claims all operatives were declared dead for security purposes. The reality is that most were actually killed to prevent them from becoming problems for their former handlers. A chill settled over the room. How many survived? Thorn asked quietly. I don't know, Your Majesty. Operational security meant we never knew each other's identities, but I would estimate very few of us escaped the termination orders. And your mission here? What were you supposed to accomplish during 3 years of tavern service? Isla was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried weight of someone making a decision that couldn't be reversed. I wasn't assigned to this kingdom, Your Majesty. I came here because it was the only territory where I might be safe from the people who wanted me dead. She met his gaze directly. I've been hiding in your taverns and noble houses because no one would think to look for a supposedly dead operative in plain sight among their servants. Safe from whom? From the political faction that ordered the program's termination? From military commanders who didn't want their unauthorized experiments exposed? From court officials who profited from arms dealing with the same enemy forces we were trained to infiltrate? The accusation hung in the air. Can you prove these allegations? I can provide names, dates, financial records, and operational details that would expose activities your enemies would kill to keep buried. Isla's voice remained level. The question is whether Your Majesty considers such information valuable enough to justify protecting someone who officially doesn't exist. Thorn leaned back, processing implications that extended far beyond a tavern incident. What would you require in exchange for this information? Official protection, a new identity. That can't be traced back to the program, and assurance that I won't be terminated once I'm no longer useful. And what guarantee do I have that you're not simply an extremely skilled operative sent to infiltrate my court through an elaborate deception? Isla smiled for the first time since the interrogation began. Your Majesty, if I were conducting a deep infiltration operation, would I have revealed my capabilities by publicly humiliating your heir? Wouldn't it have been more effective to maintain my cover and continue gathering intelligence? The logic was unassailable. Show me, Thorne said suddenly. You claim to have information that could expose treason within my court. Show me something that proves you have access to intelligence worth the risk of protecting you. Isla nodded and rose, moving to the table. May I, Your Majesty? At his gesture of permission, she selected a specific file and opened it to reveal financial records. Lord Commander Blackwood authorized payments to 3 different weapons suppliers during the height of the fighting, she said, pointing to specific entries. What those records don't show is that 2 of those suppliers were actually fronts for enemy pack operations, and that a significant percentage of the weapons purchased never reached your forces. She traced connections between documents with practiced ease. The missing weapons were diverted to enemy units who used them against your own soldiers. Lord Commander Blackwood received substantial payments for facilitating these diversions. Payments that were laundered through accounts connected to the Crimson Dagger program's operational budget. You're saying Blackwood was selling weapons to our enemies while my soldiers were dying. I'm saying that Blackwood and others used the chaos of the border conflicts to profit from arms sales to both sides, and that they eliminated the operatives who could expose their activities when the war ended and investigations became possible. Thorne studied the documents, cross-referencing information that painted a picture of systematic betrayal. Lord Commander Ironwood, he said quietly, I want immediate investigation into these financial discrepancies. Full audit of all military procurement from the past decade. Yes, Your Majesty. And I want discreet surveillance placed on anyone connected to these transactions. He turned back to Isla. You'll remain in protective custody while we verify this information. But your status is now officially that of intelligence asset rather than prisoner. Captain Morris will arrange more appropriate accommodations and security protocols. Thank you, Your Majesty. Don't thank me yet. If your information proves accurate, then you'll be helping expose conspiracies that certain people have killed to protect. That makes you extremely valuable and extremely dangerous. As guards prepared to escort her to new quarters, Thorne spoke her name one final time. Miss Merrick, you should know that my son is extremely displeased about last night's events. He's been making inquiries about your background and expressing opinions about appropriate responses to public humiliation. The warning was clearly delivered. I understand, Your Majesty. Do you? Because Prince Adrian has never learned the value of strategic patience, and he has access to resources that make personal vendettas dangerous for everyone involved. Isla's smile was sharp and entirely confident. Your Majesty, if your son wishes to continue our discussion, I'll be happy to provide additional demonstrations of why underestimating one's opponents can lead to educational experiences. As she was led from the throne room toward a future that balanced enormous opportunity against equally enormous risk, Isla reflected on the irony of her situation. She had spent 3 years hiding from enemies who wanted her dead, only to discover that safety might come from embracing the very identity she had been concealing. Sometimes the best way to disappear was to become indispensable to the people with the power to make you vanish, and sometimes the deadliest weapon in any conflict was the one your enemies never saw coming until it was already too late to matter. The Crimson Dagger operative known as Isla Merrick was about to discover whether her gamble would lead to redemption or destruction. But either way, she was finally done pretending to be helpless.